So yeah, it's not going to be like an academic lecture or like academic research. I've never done academic research about Right to the City itself, but rather it's, as Emil said, during my studies and then later work, I was working on different projects, but this concept was always like coming up in any work that I did. Not any work, but most of the works. So that's why I wanted to like trace this concept through my projects and my works. So yeah, and this is sort of like a content, so I will try to talk about right to the city, talking about the private domain, about public domain, and about contested domain, and then give you my reflections on the whole concept. But before starting talking about my own projects and work, I would like to give some background information on Right to the City. So Right to the City, it's mainly like a framework, so it's not legal, actually legally binding law or rule or legislation that is used by the country. So normally it's a framework that is used by urban social movements to fight for the spaces in the cities in different aspects of the city. So it's housing, public places, streets, infrastructure, social inclusion, and etc. So it's very broad framework, I would say. And it was developed by Henry Lefebvre. He is a French philosopher and sociologist. And he established this concept, Right to the City, in 1960s during the social protests in France. So it was the uprising by students, and it's actually when a lot of inequalities are being shown up in our cities. And he was studying these inequalities, and then he wrote his famous book, Urban Civilization and then Right to the City, where he was mainly talking about Right to the City as something that we have to give to the oppressed and marginalized groups of our communities and societies. And it was because of the, like, for this accumulation of the capital and all this functional planning. So there are so many people who didn't get it. Noise, okay. Some aliens. So yeah, he was mainly talking about the oppressed groups in the city, so we have to give the right to the city to them. And was in this context that this framework appeared, and of course nowadays it changed a lot because since 1960s a lot of things have changed. So yeah, so if we discuss right to the city as a concept, we can also ask ourselves whose right it is to the city exactly. And as I said, for Henry it was mainly, as he described, a cry and demand for the oppressed groups. And it was also the collective right, so it was not an individual right of the separate people or of the rights in the city, but it was a collective demand to demand our spaces and streets and everything like that. But then later today, a lot of discourses are being done to discuss right to the city, not in terms of this, also in terms of collective right, but also in terms of the city users. Because, for instance, if we take the concept of citizenship, we can claim citizenship is like a framework to demand rights in the city, right? But also sometimes we are not citizens of some cities. For instance, we are traveling or we are just temporarily living somewhere. Then do we have the right to these cities, for instance? And in this context, it gives like a different direction. And a lot of, like, let's say scholars, they say that you don't have to have a citizenship in this country or in the city to claim your rights. So it's merely enough to be a user of the city. And especially nowadays, if we think about cities, because cities are become, for instance, digitalized, so we have this whole surveillance cameras. So we become like data points for the cities because they can collect information about us as users, as digital users, and then they can use this information, for instance, for something else to decide the planning and stuff like this. So we have also to demand the sort of city's rights towards us. So now it's a bit changing, but again, as I said, it's changing because the concept of the city is changing nowadays. And then if we talk about the right to the city, to what city exactly do we have a right to? So for Henry, back in 1960s, it was not city in our conventional understanding of the city, but it was more about the urban space. It can be anything, public, squares, streets, or maybe even larger than the city itself. So it was more about the space and the presence of the people in the space. Yeah, and also he was not actually talking about changing existing city as such, because he was actually so much deep involved in his philosophical discussions about the right to the city. Also, he didn't give like practical implications how we can exercise this right to the city, like as people or society. He was mainly talking about it in very abstract terms. So that's why he was always referring to the future city, like how the future city or the new society have to be like according to this concept. But of course, nowadays it also changed because the right to the city became like a slogan for the urban social movements, but it also became, they also tried to implement it in human rights frameworks by the United Nations, stuff like this. In a lot of countries, they accept human rights or right to the city in their legislations and state legislations and city legislations. So David Harvey, he was one of the followers of Henry Lefebvre, and he said that right to the city is the right to actively shape the city to one's desires and needs, thus exercising one's full citizenship. So again, like when he's talking, and he's still alive, so it's like nowadays sort of approach to right to the city. So even when he's talking about right to the city, it's again about citizenship. But he's talking not about the nation-state citizenship, but more about urban citizenship. So again, we are, as the users of any city we are at the moment, we have certain rights and certain demands that we can claim or we can demand from the government, from the municipalities, and etc. So just to summarize this theoretical part of the founder of the right to the city movement and of like nowadays discussions, it's basically about two things. It's about production and use of space. So the use of space, it means the right to appropriate urban space. So it's full and complete use of urban spaces if you're talking about living, playing, working in the urban spaces. And the second thing is about production of the urban space. It's the right to participation. So people have to have a central role in decision-making processes. And also, for instance, in this concept, maybe like nation-state citizenship would be more applicable because it also implies legal like rules, legal attributes in order to be able to make an influence on the decision-making processes. I'll just shortly say, so the right to the city means active citizenship. So right to the city is a performative act, right? Of course, you can also stay at home or do nothing, and then you will be still having this right to the city. But right to the city is something that you have to perform somehow. And there is also this World Charter for the right to the city, and it actually implies that all the people who inhabit a city, whether permanently or transitionally, are considered its citizens. So this is what I was talking about, this contesting notions of citizenship in urban spaces. So, but today, of course, yeah, as I said, it's changing because of the digital cities and all this information and communication technologies in the cities. We have to question ourselves what exactly it means, and we have to approach this right to the city as a framework in order to make further steps or further implications in the legal regulations and everything. So this was very shortly like about theoretical part, I would say. And then I wanted to just reflect. So during my projects or when I was working, what it meant, the right to the city. So, and I wanted to start talking about the private domain, and it was basically during my master thesis research when I was studying informal settlements in Portugal and Turkey, and I was looking how actually people refer to their informal settlements and to their informal housing in these two different contexts. And actually, the main focus research was not right to the city. Just right to the city, it was one of the aspects that I used to study the phenomena. But just long story short, so the outcome of my research was that in these two different countries, they were using different tactics to engage with informal settlements and to eradicate the informal settlements. So in Portugal, it was mostly about so the state was marginalizing the communities, the population in the informal settlements, and they were calling them criminals. So they were really criminalizing the informal settlements, and that was the tool, or like that would help them to eradicate them. So they built this discourse on purpose. And in Turkey, it was not. They were not referring to criminalization, to the criminal situation of the informal settlements, but they were referring to the environmental problems that existed in this informal settlement. So actually it's from Turkey, so it's a bit hilly, And then they were saying, okay, because it's such a landscape, informal settlements cannot be there. So they were always referring to the nature, to the environment, that we have to eradicate them, and then they build these high-rise buildings on the places of the informal settlements, yeah, where they put the informal settlers and the new people. And it was it was very different approaches how to deal with the informal settlements, but the outcome was the same, that people were evicted and they had to move somewhere else. But in Portugal, it was very explicitly done, so they were criticizing a lot. But in Turkey, they were like sneaky and they were very implicit, so they were saying, no, you can stay here, but then you have to take the loans from the bank, for instance, to be able to pay off the apartments in the new buildings. And people just couldn't afford it, so like they were forced, not directly, but indirectly, to move out. That was not about Right to the City, but it was my project about. But then I encouraged it so many times when people were talking about right to housing, and when I was, during the interviews, when I was discussing them, this right to the housing notion, they were always referring to right to the city. So for them, they needed this right to the housing, which means they also needed that right to the city, and this is what they didn't get. Like in academia, let's say, it's discussed a lot that a possibility to provide a house for oneself is a performative nature of citizenship. So again, the citizenship is implied having this right to the housing and right to the city, and it's again performative. And as an outcome, people were rejected of this right to the housing and right to the city consequently because of these policies and interventions. And also, of course, the housing has a different notion and connotation nowadays, because it's not considered to be a social good for the society, for the people, but it became commodified a lot due to speculations and other processes in the neoliberal policies, let's say, in the cities. So because of this commodification, also this right has been denied for the people. And so yeah, informality does not only represent the status quo of the settlements, but it was also the source of power and authority, like who and what matters in the space. So obviously, the city government preferred other stakeholders who saw the housing as a commodity over the social good, so they preferred to choose this path. And it was also interesting, actually, it was in Portugal, and then it was during the meeting with, so this woman, she was like from a former United Nations commissioner on right to the housing. And then during the discussion, so when the discussion started, people were talking mostly about their belonging to the space, how they belong to the house, to their houses, like what memories they had. So it was really emotionally attached something to their places. But then later, when she was asking them, but how do you resist? What do you do in order to confront the municipality? They were saying, yeah, we don't do much because we don't have time. And then after some time, they just started to argue between themselves, because they were saying, oh no, but I was trying to resist, but this woman, she got more money. So it was, then it just switched the whole conversation to the commodity itself. And for me, it was also very interesting that people, like what we used to think about the housing as a social good, and people actually attach these feelings of belonging, memories, and etc. And then because of these policies by the state, they themselves started to think about housing as a commodity only. So that's why it was one of the reasons why there was no resistance as such to these new policies and interventions. And yeah, it's just an interesting example, but there is one artist, and he's trying to prove the right to the city of these people by making graffiti. So basically, he's drawing graffitis on the houses, and it means actually, but people are still living there. So it means that once this house will be destroyed, someone's life will be destroyed. So there's going to erase them for good. Because also there are not good alternatives for them, so they either become homeless or they have to go back to like Capo Verde. It's the island where mainly a lot of people are coming from. And it's interesting also, so the mayor of the municipality where the settlement is, she said that we all have the right to the housing and right to the city, but it cannot be the way that people want it. So she was very, she didn't want to discuss any of the topics like with anyone, not even from when people were coming from the United Nations to defend their rights or any researchers or anything. So yeah, for me it was just interesting how the for people, like when they were talking about their private spaces, their houses, they were always referring to the right to the city not as the right to the public places or to something public, but to their private. And so that's why also what I said, right to the city, it crosses so many boundaries and aspects and domains, even private as homes. And so the public domain, I wanted to talk about reclaiming streets and public spaces, and mainly by women. Because if you think about the public space, it is a space that have to represent all society, right? Like all people are living in the society. So, and as you can see, cities are supposed to be built for all of us, but they aren't built by all of us, which means that historically women were not included in the urban planning and the architecture design. So that's why nowadays we reap these results of the urban planning, which is not really focused on how women are using the city. And it was, of course, during the researches I was working with this a bit, but also as a girl, like I was always reflecting on how I use the city. Why do I choose cross here but not here? Why I choose to avoid this place, for instance? And I think even like before I started this topic, I was always like analyzing myself, why am I behaving in this way? And it was actually in Spain during March 8th demonstration that we started to, draw these slogans on the cardboards, and we went to the demonstration, and then we were talking just with people, and then we realized that we don't actually know how women are using the city, and it would be so useful, and I know that a lot of groups, they're actually studying how women are using the city, and then include it in these policy-making decisions. But we just decided why we don't do it ourselves, just in different cities. We gather some local women in the neighborhoods, and then we go for a walk and see what they need or not. And I think it's also a good idea, like in any city, just do this, just as a research or just as a personal experience. So we called it exploratory walks, and it could be used, I think, as a tool for women to navigate like through the security and mobility infrastructures in the cities. And what we realized, and maybe you heard some of them, is that, for instance, if you compare men and women, like how men are moving in the city, it's very, normally it's like this. So it's point A, point B, they go to work, they go back, so they have not so many points of interaction with the city, generally. But women are using the city much more. First of all, they don't have cars. They have, but a majority of them they don't have. So they need to use public transport, or they need to walk. And they're using more points in the city, like kindergarten, school, some shops, then work, and etc. So the trajectory is so much different. And actually, it was in Copenhagen interesting, because planning of Copenhagen is like 5 fingers. So it's like this, the city, and there is not good connection between like here. So the trains, all the trains, they go like this. But for instance, like I met so many women who live here, but they need to go to the kindergarten here, so they have to go to the city center and then take the train here. And of course, there are also like natural parks, I think one of them here, but still, I think this issue should be tackled, like to make it easier for women to use the cities. So it's a lot about mobility, but also about infrastructure, because, for instance, we also encountered that women do not have, in some cities, women do not have enough public toilets, like in the cities, because physiologically women have to go more often to the toilet. It's like a well-known fact. So that's why we need it more, but then we just don't have it, and then it makes so inconvenient and so uncomfortable and so unfair and unjust for women. And also a lot of public toilets, they don't have, like the doors sometimes are not wide enough to take the baby strollers, for instance. So it also has to be considered. And if we talk about playgrounds, actually this was during the work that I've done for this consulting company. So Windrose is a company, and then they wanted us to like see what the future of living will be like, how people will be living in the future. And like we analyzed a lot of aspects, how people will live in the future. And then when we were thinking about the playgrounds, like next to the housings, we were analyzing like few playgrounds in Copenhagen, and then we saw that we also did interviews. And then there was an interesting situation that girls until age of 9, they were actively using the playgrounds. But like at the age of 9, 10, they stopped, and it was only boys who were using the playgrounds. And then we were analyzing, and it was because a lot of playgrounds they're like, so the football field or like a bigger field is in the city of the in the center of the playground, and then a lot of boys, they play football there. So when girls, they're small, so they also run, you know, we were just observing, so they were included in this space, but when they grow a bit older, like their interests just shift, so they want to sit more, they want to talk more, and so this place was occupied mainly by guys, and because there were no infrastructure around, like for the girls were just excluded from these places. So just one small example how like observations and about our physical space can tell so much more about how different genders are using the places. I just included it because it's interesting. So when we did these walks, it's also very, very interesting how you use your 5 senses to kind of explore the space around you. Because normally we just pay attention to what we see, but also if we use attention to what we hear, like what sounds, is it noisy, is it not too noisy, what smells, or just how the women or any person feels in the space, if he's scared or she, like it gives like a huge profile about the space itself and how different perceptions are there. Voting with your feet, I just like the phrase. I think it says a lot that we actually make choices by actually performing these acts, like whenever we decided to go somewhere or not to go somewhere, it just says so much more. And this was also very interesting for me about Ride to the City, because it was in Copenhagen, and then we did the research in this neighborhood, and it's very like functionalist, I would say, planning, so it's like just streets and housing blocks. And then when we talked to people who are living in these houses, so you would imagine that home is a private space, private domain, and the public space or the street is public sort of domain. But for women, a lot of women there, they said like, so they don't feel free at home because there are so many extra relatives living together with them, so they're always like under control, like Big Brother is watching, even though they have internet, they said, so we can actually get out to the wider space. But for them, the city was actually, so they said something personal space. It was a place of freedom where they could liberate themselves. And few women, they even mentioned they have this intimate even relationship with the space outside of the city, outside of the home, because it's actually where they can practice their citizenship, they can claim something, but not at home. And this was a new library that was, I think it's not finished yet, but it's just like a project. So we didn't advise them, but we just went there and told them, so you guys, because they don't have any public space there, so it would be a good idea to build like a public space next to the library, especially include these women from there. And then I wanted to talk about the contested domain, I called it, but it's more about urban exploration. And urban exploration is the act of accessing some territories or some areas which are not accessible to the wider public. Some of them are restricted, some of them are just hidden. So it could be tunnels, it could be abandoned buildings, or what else? Yeah, something that you would normally don't go to. And it's also interesting phenomenon for me, because when you talk to these people, they say that for them, it's sort of representation of active participation in the city. So by this, it's a form of activism. And they try to reclaim the spaces. Because again, a lot of them, they're claiming that a lot of spaces are being privatized nowadays because of different policies. And they actually want to claim that the city is theirs. So that's why they do these sometimes crazy things. So yeah, another question, if it's legal or not, because a lot of places are actually restricted, have restricted access to the people. But then if it's not even restricted, normally the land is either the local municipality, a local authority, or it's private land. And then if you enter, then you have to bear the consequences. But again, it's about discussing and what is this. And also it became sort of commercialized, so it's touristification, I call it, because nowadays you see so many people, so they're bored to go to these cathedrals and to cultural highlights of the cities, so they want to explore something different, something new, something exciting. So they go to these tunnels, and there are these excursions organized that you have to pay, and then a lot of people go to the tunnels, or like high-rise buildings, the structures, the roofs of the buildings, and actually they vandalize it, they harm, and they do not very good stuff. So it's another side. So that's why I think urban exploration, it's not like a community worldwide, because every group, they have very different motivations, like why they do it. And it's actually, so Bradley Garrett, he's a scholar from London, and he's also urban explorer. And with him and like research group and him, we did exploration of Vienna. So we went to different places to sort of ask ourselves what is public, what is private, what is the boundary between public and private. And so yeah, and then he's a very cool urban explorer. You can read about him more. He wrote a book, and then he was taken to the police so many times, and I think he even spent 1 year in prison or something in the UK. And they even, so after his PhD, he was writing his book, and I think the authorities in London, they contacted the publisher, his publisher, and they told him that you cannot publish this book because it's about illegal access to some of the city places. But of course, they did it anyway. And I actually like the last part, because he said, so whenever the doors are closed, we will find a way through. Whenever the history is buried, we will uncover it. And wherever architecture is exclusionary, we will liberate it. So for him, it's actually claiming his rights to the city by going to all these hidden and abandoned places. And it was actually, so this was for the exhibition that we did. And I'm not saying that everyone has to do it, because sometimes it's dangerous, or you always have to know the limits also. Can you go there? Like what consequences you can possibly bear, and etc. But it was very interesting for me to reflect on the right to the city and to see this boundary between private and public, because a lot of spaces, like for instance this, it was not restricted, so you could actually go, it's like under the river, and then you could actually go under, like nothing was restricting me, just the stairs, you took the stairs, and then you just walk through the tunnel. But no one is using this space, right? And we also have to ask ourselves why we are not using some of the places in the city. Or this was also a very interesting example. It's like a public hospital, and then it's the roof, and then there are these two buildings. And then when I was standing like up there, and then one of the windows, I just saw a man. So he was after the surgery, and like, you know, all the doctors, they were like around him. And I felt so weird, because it was a public place in a way. It's a roof, it's a public hospital, like I had an easy access to this. But then I was kind of looking at someone's private matters of lives, of personality. So yeah, I didn't feel like nice or something, but I think this kind of feelings, they're so important for us to realize the boundaries in the cities and of our personal experiences. Yeah, it's another place. It's just, so it's actually a green urban space, but no one is using it because it's like a bit down, and there is a tram going on there. But again, like why people are not using it, right? So yeah, that was just the sort of artistic approach to the right to the city that we had. And then just a small example of actually, because I talked about right to the city, it's a very broad topic and phenomenon, but how can you actually put it into the practice, right? How you can influence the decision making in the cities using this concept, very wide concept. And it was actually, so it was in Madrid, and it started as a research when we were students. So we just had a task like to organize a space at the public square. And so because in my group, and the task was like to use this right to the city, let's say, approach. And in my group, there were a lot of architects and urban planners, so like very technical people. So they were saying, okay, we can just go one time to the square, maybe see what's there, and then we can do something, put more benches, like as they normally do, for more trees. But because I studied anthropology, so for me, like in every, I think, research, it's very important to go and talk to people and observe them, etc. So that's what we did. I think for a week we went 3 or 4 times per day just to observe like what people are using the space, what age, gender. It's not very pretty because it was during my studies. But yeah, so basically we just mapped all gender, age, and etc. And the whole point of this is that, so 2 years ago they announced like a contest to redevelop the square, and then my professor contacted me, and then actually some of the ideas are being implemented like to the redesign of the square, which means that this approach to actually show who has the right to this public place is very important, because also you have to take into consideration like this place, it's also an immigrant neighborhood, and people don't have time and resources to claim their rights because they have to go to work, to earn, and etc. So they're basically using what is given to them, all the urban infrastructure facilities. But then does it mean that like we cannot produce this right to the city for them, like with the help of urban planners and researchers? So this is what we did, and yeah. I don't know if it's interesting, but so we just proposed some ideas, because on the map you can see there was like an elderly, a community center for older people there. So that's why you see a lot of like red dots there, but there were no benches or no infrastructure for them to sit. So normally they would just leave the community center and like stand there for very long hours or sit on the, I don't know, like on the pavement, which was weird. So now they're actually installing some of the infrastructure there. And this is interesting because, so P is police, and there is a police station. And so whenever the police cars have to go somewhere, so normally they cross the square either this direction or this direction. But the orange dots, it's teenagers, and they're always playing football, like next to the police station. And the police officer are always so mad because whenever they go by car, like there are kids with this ball, soccer ball, and so they have this conflict all the time. But surprisingly, they don't like resolve it. So now they are putting like a fence to separate police station and the football field, let's say. The gender was also very interesting because there is a playground, and you could clearly see on one of them that so many women are like concentrating along the line, and also men are there especially. But along the line, you don't have any benches. So people are watching the kids who are playing on the playground, but they don't have anything to sit in. So now they're also putting some benches there. Yeah, and this is just sort of a conclusion because we just showed them that some of the space is overused. So you actually have to rearrange and redistribute the functions of the space. Some of the space is ignored. This football field, it's ignored. It actually has a sense to use the space, and it has all the tools, but it's being ignored. So yeah, that was just a small example. And so yeah, as I said already, like I sort of always think about what is the right to the city, what rights do I have in different cities, even if I'm not a citizen, where I live currently. And so actually just last year, few months ago, we did an experiment with some of my friends. We were living in the public library for 21 days. And for me, it was just interesting to see, because it was a public library and also a university library. And I still had my university card. So I just wanted to experience what it is like to claim my right to the city by actually living in the library, because I had a university card, I had residence permit, so according to all the legal issues, I was the citizen of the city. And it was very interesting because we experienced so many encounters by the security officers. They were trying to kick us out, but we were saying, come on, but we have the right to be here, even at night, because we are studying, or we just fell asleep. So I think it was a good experience to reflect on this, and also to see how spaces are different in different times of the day. Because at night, it's a separate story what's going on in these libraries. There are some homeless men coming to this library, and they're really fighting for the sofas to sleep in when we were there, but we were like, no, we are now here, and they said, no, you cannot be here because it's our sofa. So it's very interesting how the society is claiming in different ways these spaces. And so yeah, it was very, I think, personal, the whole presentation through my projects. And just, I think I want everyone to reflect sort of what rights do we have in the city, what we don't have, how we can claim it, and especially nowadays that we have so many new technologies being implemented in different cities, how we can actually make it not for worth for us, but doing something good for us. Yeah, I think that's it.